generally very peaky in nature. The high torque, high power is biased very late in the RPM range, leaving very little in the normal, call it mid-range usage of the engine. From the beginning, this was a decision point for the LT6. In moving a Corvette from a typical small block, low-end torque to this, we wanted to find the right balance to maintaining enough displacement and enough low-end torque, but still capture that very high engine speed, very high horsepower benefit that you get from a highly tuned flat plane crank engine. That's where we fell on, or we worked our way to the 5.5 liters. Gives us enough low-end torque as well as enough capability to get to that high speed. And what further enables that is the intake manifold in its design on the engine. Through the dual massive 87mm throttle bodies feeding each plenum, we have 3 communicator valves between the 2 plenums. Those valves actively change state throughout the RPM band. And what this does is it changes the intake manifold, and it allows the system to achieve 1.1 VE throughout a very wide RPM range. And you see that in the torque curve of this engine. After about 3,000 RPM, the torque comes up as the intake tuning up. It maintains a very flat torque curve compared to normal or naturally aspirated engines that you see in the market that don't have that level of intake manifold tuning and design. So the LT6 fuel cutoff at 8,600 RPM decision kind of came with the 5.5 liter decision. It was part of a balancing act between speed and maintaining displacement or torque at low speeds. So we could have gone to 9,000 RPM, but if you look at the LT6 power and torque curve, it's about 8,500 is where you start to saturate its ability to breathe. So in order for it to continue to build power past that, we would have to take the displacement down and sacrifice some of the low end. This was absolutely something we toyed with and optimized through analysis many different ways. I can't even count the different iterations we did of speed versus displacement to find the sweet point. So with the 5.5 liters was the right flat plane crank V8 in a Corvette from our team's perspective to balance that torque curve but still achieve the 670 horsepower at 8,600 RPM. The benefit to shifting 670 horsepower to 9,000 RPM and let the low-end torque curve fall off, in our view, was not the right thing for a Corvette customer. It's not what they would be driving in, using more of the time than they would be at the top.
Now the LT6 has the latest iteration of Bosch's direct injection system, which comprises of new high-pressure fuel pumps that are cam-driven. The internals have been changed to produce higher levels of pressure. The fuel rails have been reinforced, or the end caps, to deliver that fuel to much smaller direct injectors. They have a finer spray pattern and new direct injection drivers. The other part of designing this direct injection system was they put it on the exhaust side, and this is something they did in their IndyCar program. This offers them plenty of benefits in terms of performance and packaging. However, they also had to redesign the exhaust manifolds because of the fueling choice that they made, which meant they had to design the exhaust manifold to sweep away from the engine. But not only that, is when you put the DI system on the exhaust side, you have to deal with thermal management, and this is something that they looked at every single component of this, from shielding the high-pressure fuel pumps to using integrated water jackets so that coolant runs past the fuel rails to keep everything at bay so you don't heat soak that setup. Now the other consideration is carbon buildup from DI systems. And according to the engineers, this is less of a problem, assuming you are driving this car at its limits and not just cold starting the car every once in a while in a garage.
As God intended, Mark. And to bring that up as well, one of the more interesting questions with the C8 Z06 and the LT6 is how this was co-developed with their C8R and LT6R motorsports program.
So the LT6 and the LT6R were always envisioned together. The C8 was always intended to have the Z06 with this LT6 mission statement that I talked about in it. So the development of the two really started from the same point. We have what we call a balanced architecture phase. That's where we took the LT6 from an idea, from the mission statement of what it must achieve, and started turning it into an engine design. Then, as I said, as the production engine then progressed, it progressed in the consumer space. We did not have the racing restrictions, but we had emissions compliance and certifications and things like that that we had to meet. So the exhaust differentiated for those two things. The LT6R can run open exhaust all day, that's fine. We have to worry about ours in how we cold start, light off the catalyst, once again to be emission compliant with this naturally aspirated V8 in the market that we have today. Independent throttle bodies versus the intake manifold throttle bodies is an interesting perspective. The LT6R and the LT6 opposite ways on that. The LT6R does run independent throttle bodies in their intake manifold. Given they are limited by their restrictor, they went down this path for the advantages that throttle bodies at the ports give you. The quick throttle response and the low restriction. What they don't have is the ability to tune their intake manifold actively across the RPM range that we have in the production engine. They've tailored their engine to 7,000 to 7,300 RPM where they run the track all day. Peak power, that's the focus, that's where they're tuned. What we gain by having an intake manifold without individual throttle bodies is we can change the volume of that intake manifold with the 3 INTVs between the two plenums, and then those work with the individually cylinder tuned trumpets that are in the intake to broaden our high volumetric efficiency on the intake manifold across a longer frequency range, or read that as wider RPM band. So in a road car where you're going to use the engine across a much broader RPM range on the track, it's more advantage to have the nice flat torque curve we have versus the limitations of the individual throttle bodies. You can only tune it to one tuning frequency, which would then be very peaky and biased towards the top end.
Switch and save $652. It's okay. There's enough for everyone.
Jack, we've heard a lot about the engine and what the Z06 is, but let's talk about the body structure. From the very beginning of C8, it was going to be much more than a Stingray. Maybe it was going to be a Z06 or a 6000 SUX.
Or a ZR1. They made sure that some of the key components could be carried over, things like wheel bearings and control arms. From a distance, when you're looking at the C8 Z06, you may be thinking to yourself, particularly if it's not equipped with the optional Z07 package, that looks very similar to a regular C8 Stingray. But let me tell you, it's 3.6 inches wider, and the front fascia is much larger for their larger openings for the aero of this vehicle. But you want to walk me through some of the body panel structures, Mark?
That 3.6 inch width change comes from the wheel and tire package, of course. All the panels are completely different. They're all SMC, with the exception of the front and rear bumpers, which are impact resistant material.
Z06, Mark, are the available aerodynamic packages for this vehicle. So in the base configuration, it is essentially a no downforce, but more importantly, no lift configuration. So if you're looking to do top speed runs, this is the package you pick. Then you can option the deletion of the stall guardians in the front and a wicker to the rear, where at 186 miles an hour produces 360 pounds of downforce. Then if you add the Z07 package, it adds canards to the front, a giant carbon fiber wing to the rear, and that car produces 734 pounds of downforce at 186 miles an hour.
And aero stability is hypercritical to a car like this, and they had to think about this right from the get-go. And some of this is things they learned from race cars. Clearly, this mid-engine architecture allows them to have a completely flat floor, which is a big deal. The other part is something they learned from Pratt & Miller, their race cars, is these underbody strakes that run towards the center panel of the car. They help to move air from the front out to the sides of the car, but more importantly, they help to create negative pressure, which also helps to smooth airflow out the back of the car. This is about stability, and these strakes were overdeveloped to the point where they were able to achieve a 70